everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. I was planning really for a different speech, but well, for the attacks that happened in Brussels a few days ago. So thank you, ISIS, for screwing my work. They always do that. And like it was, to be honest, I'm sick and tired of talking on this subject of extremism. Like I always get these invitations, even though that's not one of them because it wasn't the plan that I wasn't planning terrorist attack. But like always the same discussion about whenever a terrorist attack happened, the same folks go up on television, the same arguments over and over again, as if like nothing has changed, as in the mindsets. And the problem also is that most of these discussions happen only when there's a terrorist attack happen in the West. And that's very problematic because it always talks about the problem when it happens. They always talk about, oh, okay, terrorist attack happened in the West, let's talk about it. They don't know that this issue of this cult for now the radical Islam is a problem that is global. There's a 9/11 happening in Iraq and Syria every week. The amount of people that are getting killed all over, I mean, I think in Cote d'Ivoire there was an attack happening, in Turkey, all over the place, that generally tend to be ignored. And what's also very interesting is that many of the folks who are I'll call them the apologists, they always say like, they don't really talk about the subjects of Ankara and Turkey when it happened. But when there is an attack happening in the West and there is a focus on the West, they say, oh, you guys, why do you only focus on the West? And like when the attacks in Turkey, you never talked about them, but when the Western media start talking about attacks in the West, you start talking about them. So through my speech, I mean, this is something that I've been going on. I've met with many people who work in counterterrorism, and I try to kind of figure out, I wouldn't call it a final solution because that's a very bad term used by very bad people, but I would call it probably one of the ideas of one of the solutions for reducing the amount of terrorist attacks that happen in the West or also around the Middle East. And I would like to first start with the terminology and like what I mean by what I say. And the first word I would like to start is the term the Muslim world, which is mostly used in the media. And the definition I would like to use, it is made of people who subscribe to the identity as well as the religion called Islam. It could be a person born and raised in Saudi Arabia, or it could be someone who's a recent convert in Santa Fe in New Mexico. Anybody who subscribes to the religion of Islam or identify as a Muslim is a part of the Muslim world. So I don't mean the Muslim world just what we know, the Middle East and Southeast Asia, but rather the globe, the people who identify with religion globally. And the people in the Muslim world belong into a spectrum. So I would like to call it the Muslim ideological spectrum. And the spectrum from 0 to 10. 10 being the literalists, the people who follow things very literally, word by word. And the people who are 0, who are culturally Muslim, or just identify as Muslims. And the majority of Muslims, based upon Pew Research and Gallup polls, and belong somewhere between 6 and 7. That doesn't mean that all of them are culturally Muslim who just identify by name and drink alcohol and eat bacon. And not necessarily all of them are ISIS or support terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and so on. So from ultra-conservative, conservative, moderate, liberal, and people who are probably ex-Muslims or non-Muslims. Then there's another spectrum, which is kind of aligned with that spectrum. I wish there's, but because of the speech is very new, so I didn't have a graph for it, but which I call the political spectrum. That there are Muslims as well as Christians, and I think Jews as well, who happen to believe in theocracy. And there's a term for that in Islamic laws called Sharia law. So there are multiple ways of interpreting Sharia law, but the most moderate interpretation of Sharia law is radical if somebody believes in liberal secular democracy. Like whenever somebody says, I believe in a Sharia, but it's moderate Sharia, they just mean that they believe that gays should be thrown from the second floor, not the fourth. So that's what they mean by moderates. And I was actually joking about this today. I said, Al-Qaeda condemns the attacks made by ISIS. I said, Al-Qaeda says, we don't attack people at airports. We only just fly planes into buildings. So they are like the moderates. Like now, based upon how ISIS lowered the standards very much, is that everybody is now a moderate. Like Al-Qaeda is now the liberals of the region. So the methodology of how these people reach to theocracy differs. So there are two groups within the political spectrum. There are those who are jihadists, those who believe that they reach to the level of Sharia through use of violence, including killing civilians and instilling terror, and they see that as a mean to an end. I mean, I still remember one of the miserable days in Iraq when I was living there, and Al-Qaeda took over a mental hospital, and they used people with Down syndrome as suicide bombers. And I was trying to think about like what could be their reasoning, like what the fuck is wrong with you to do something like that? And they saw that as kind of a mean to an end, and they saw like, well, we're kind of letting these people go to heaven to achieve a goal of establishing Sharia law. So that's the way that they reason with things, and that's groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and the list goes on. And there are the people who call the Islamists. In Arabic, they're like the political party ends up with al-Islamiyin, which means the Muslim Brotherhood or Hizb al-Da'wah, who believe in enforcing Sharia law by using democracy against itself. So they generally try to work on the grassroots level, and that's based upon the teachings of their founders, Hassan al-Banna and others, who try to reach from the grassroots level. And they are less direct than jihadists in their language. They're not like ISIS, who would be like, kill the infidels, blah, 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 so you can immediately see that they're extremists. But they kind of try to have like double faces, and they try to convince liberals that they are liberal and convince conservatives that they are conservative. So like one of the examples that I've found recently here in the United States, some of the people who are involved in Islamist stuff. So for example, they say, we support same-sex marriage, which sounds like a very liberal statement, right? But that's not the end of the sentence. They say, we support same-sex marriage because we are a minority here in America, and we don't have the privilege to be bigoted. So in that way, which is kind of very interesting, so they sent a message to liberals, or mostly the Democratic Party, that they support same-sex marriage. And they sent a message to the conservatives who live in Egypt, in Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, that it's okay if you kill gays, because you are a majority over there. So that's kind of like their messaging. It's like a double messaging. So, and they say like they stand for secularism, but we stand for secularism because it protects us as minority. They don't stand for secularism as a matter of principle. So, so as I said, like they can, the Islamists, and I'm going to mention some of their names in the future, like they can meet up with President Obama or Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders and have a great meeting, and they can meet with the theocrat from Saudi Arabia, and they also have a great meeting, because they can tell the liberals here in America a different message, and they tell the conservatives in the Arab world another message. And also by finding common ground on mutual hate. So for example, why many Islamists hate the Republicans, they are very much against the Republicans, it's not because that many of them are theocratic. It's just that they are the other kind of theocratic. So like one of the famous quotes President FDR said, it was during the Cold War, and they asked him like, why do you support the fascist dictator of Nicaragua? I don't know if any of you know the quote, but he said, he could be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. So there's this, so you'll see the double thinking is that they're not actually pro-secularism. They're pro-secularism when it benefits them. And one of also the meetings through my work, I was able to meet people who were formerly the Iraqi opposition, and they were kind of involved in convincing the US government back at the time, the Bush administration, and even before then with the Iraq Liberation Act that's signed by Bill Clinton, that they support liberal values, and the moment the United States invades Iraq, they're going to create a democracy and all of that. And the moment that they got into power, they were terrible fascist dictators. And the same thing happening to some extent with the Syrian opposition. I met with some of them who consider themselves moderates, quote unquote. I think the term is now completely meaningless, but I told him, like, what do you think of Bashar al-Assad? And he said, he's a criminal fascist dictator. I'm like, okay, I'm with you on that. Then he said, what do you think? I told him, what do you think of Saddam Hussein? He's like, oh, Saddam Hussein, he's a good guy. Well, here's an example that they are not actually against dictatorship by principle. They are just, their son of a bitch is not in power. So there's another group that I think is very important, that is generally tend to be ignored, and that group is secular Muslims, the consistent secular Muslims who are still identified like as Muslims, or people who are from the Muslim world who not necessarily identify as Muslims, like myself, and those who are consistent about support for secularism. Support for secularism in Afghanistan, they support secularism in the United States, not only benefits their own communities. And so they are a minority. Many people say like, well, how can we trust in them? How can we invest in them? They are a minority, but I would say they're one of the most growing minorities, especially in the Arab and the Muslim world. That's where my most of research is focused on. And to some extent, it is a kind of a result of a backlash when they saw the rule of the Islamists, like the Muslim Brotherhood and others, and they saw ISIS and they saw Al-Qaeda, and they are and many of them millennials between 20 and 30, who say, okay, is this like Sharia? Is this what they have been teaching us in the schools for a very long time? And I don't want anything to do with Sharia. Some of them say, I don't want anything to do with Islam to begin with. So here is my terminology, and here is what I'm proposing. That could be the policy to fight against both Islamist and jihadist terrorism. And there are going to be some terms that some people may find offensive, and that's fine. We live in a free country, hopefully free country, except if Trump becomes the president, but it's not the case at the moment, so maybe that's the reason I like to give the speech right now, because you don't know if there's going to build a wall over here. My first proposal is that we have to differentiate between secular Muslims, liberal Muslims, and Islamists and jihadists, and we should not lump all Muslims together. And we should single out the folks who advocate for theocracy within the Muslim world. So the folks who are Muslims, who just want to make a living and live their lives and support secular democracy and support liberal, they are our allies, not our enemies. But our real enemies are those who want to impose theocracy. And we have to be able to differentiate and single out, to some extent, which are the good guys and which are the bad guys. And unfortunately, because of the polarization of what's happening within, it seems like, since I came to America, there's a polarization about every debate in America. There has to be like two extremes of everything. And that's affecting that discussion, because whenever there's a terrorist attack, you expect you're going to have people, in Europe, it's actually getting more intense with like Marine Le Pen and the EDL and many of the far right groups in which let's build a wall, kick all the Muslims out. And then there's on the other side, on the far left, like for example, we have Bernie Sanders t-shirt over here. Hi. So like for example, Bernie, I think yesterday, tweeted that this thing has, I'm not going to quote him literally, but said like, this has nothing to do with religion. All of these attacks, all of this terrorism, it had nothing to do with religion. And anybody who, I don't think he said that, but he kind of implied that anybody who thinks that it's made something to do with some religion is kind of bigoted and racist. And that's, so you see like the polarization is between all Muslims are terrorists, all interpretation of Islam is bad, and then it has nothing to do with Islam, and let's kick them, not let's kick them out. So anybody who criticizes that is racist. And this polarization is the most people who are damaged by this, I would say, are the secular and liberal Muslims, especially, I would say, women's rights activists who try to change things in their own communities. And somebody tells them, no, there's nothing wrong with religion. All what you're complaining about is our fault. It's like, I'm sorry, I'm an American white person who's very guilty about being white, and I would like to apologize for our US foreign policy. And eventually stop the work of the people who are actually trying to change things in their own communities. And so this is I think, is a very important, that's why I put it as the first amendments of the proposal. And second one is, as I said previously, is that we should support the consistent secular Muslims, not those who say we support secularism here because we're a minority, but when you are in Egypt, you suddenly believe in the Muslim Brotherhood. It doesn't work this way. It's like you have to stand up for principle, for its sake, not only because it's benefiting you or benefiting your own people. And Christopher Hitchens once said about, which I think is one also very important point, is the empowerment of women, which is something that also tend to be very ignored. And I'm dedicating many part of my organization actually to focus on women's rights and try to advance the cause of women's rights in these societies, that many of them tend to be oppressive. I mean, this quote may not be related to Islam, but it's related to Mother Teresa, that Christopher Hitchens said, but I think it's very important. He was talking about Mother Teresa in a book called The Missionary Position, which is kind of a very funny title. So I will not call it as my favorite book because that may sound awkward. So he said that Mother Teresa was not a friend of the poor, she was a friend of poverty. She said that suffering was a gift from God. She spent her life opposing the only known cure for poverty, which is the empowerment of women and the emancipation of them from a livestock version of compulsory reproduction. So like one of our main focuses, and I would say my own personal focus, is the empowerment of women, because it is to a large extent a cure of poverty, a large extent a cure of extremism, and so on. And unfortunately, because of this cultural relativistic nonsense happening within the left, is that, oh, maybe it's their culture, and we're not going to judge them. No concept of really moral objectivism that you can actually say that, yes, women in these societies, no woman chooses to have an FGM. Maybe 1% of all probably have a mental disease. But the issue that you say, like, oh, because it's their culture, and that removes what is a moral responsibility, that there are people over there who are suffering, and mostly women in societies like Afghanistan and Pakistan, which they have acid thrown at their faces by the Taliban, and we should be able to help these people. And mostly the women rights activists who are familiar with the communities, who speak the language, who are able to make change from within, try to help women in their own country. And the other proposal is to support the liberals, including the atheists, because generally atheists tend to be ignored, unfortunately, because many people think that, like especially I met with many people in the State Department and others, and who think that like the term atheist comes with very baggage, which is true to some extent. But at the same time, as I said, it's the largest growing minority, and many of them believe in liberal and secular values. So if your end goal is to some extent a modernization and to have a much more peaceful Middle East, then atheists should not be thrown under the bus just because they happen to be non-strategic at the moment. But I think they are strategic because I mean, there's a lot of this discussion about reforming Islam and having a modern version of Islam and so on, which I support 100%, but it's not the only thing I support. I mean, if the end goal is to have a liberal secular democracies or liberalization and modernization in the Arab and the Muslim world, then if the reform movement does not succeed or does not convince the 1.5, not necessarily 1.5 billion, but a significant amount of them, then probably we can try apostatization as an alternative if the reform doesn't work. And it's also, I mean, I've seen there's a very good case by a guy called Ahmed Harqan. He's an Egyptian, he used to be a Salafist, like kind of like the hardcore Muslim. And because he used to adhere to the principles very literally and very fundamentally, I think he read a book by either Dawkins or Hitchens or something like that, or in which somebody told him, like, all of this is complete bullshit, okay? Like, all what you believe in is just nonsense. And that approach, it may sound like very offensive, like, how can you say that? That approach actually worked with someone who believes in this very dearly, you know? So like when somebody comes in and punch him in the face, not literally punch him in the face, but kind of like gave him a shock argument, this actually could be a much better counter narrative than just like, oh, my friend, let's shake hands, let's think kumbaya. Like sometimes the aggressive approach actually works with some people who believe in things aggressively. And that's why like you see that people like Sam Harris and Bill Maher, and who are like, I wouldn't call them aggressive atheists or militant atheists because that's bullshit. Like the difference between militant atheists and militant jihadists is completely different. Like, I mean, militant atheists write books, and militant jihadists blaze into buildings. So there's no comparison between militants, but I'm going to use it just for the sake of argument, that the people who are aggressive, like they tend to like criticize religion all the time, you see them, they actually have a lot of popular support within the atheists of the Arab world compared to the people who tend to follow a much PC, lovely approach. And because the people that are living under very strong circumstances and very tough, so they need this guy who telling them like, yes, let's do this. Like they want this energy. And also, it's very there is a very good book. I mean, it's one of I'll say my favorites. It's a book by a historian called Bernard Lewis. He's a historian at Princeton, and he wrote a book called What Went Wrong. So that's generally a question that is asked about the Muslim world, is that what's going on? Like the Muslim world, at least the Arab world back then, like for a significant amount of time used to be advanced in science and in philosophy and all of these things. And what the hell happened? Like why the decline happened? And you'll notice that it's actually the same reason why what is happening right now between Iraq and Syria being mostly proxy wars between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And before, it was the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire that kind of, because of the Sunni-Shia conflict, kept, for a large extent, and also, I mean, there are so many reasons why. I mean, I recommend the book, and I also recommend reading as much as possible on the subject, so I'm not going to give you the full answer here. But my conclusion is that the Enlightenment values, the values of freedom of speech and freedom of for inquiry and women's rights and the individual rights. I mean, the idea of women having the right as individuals to make choices for their own lives is actually not very common within these collective societies that tend to have, like even if you look at the Charlie Hebdo attack, for example, and so I was trying to look at the comments and what the hell the Muslim Brotherhood is talking and all of these things. So they have no concept of what actually freedom of speech actually mean. Because many of them live in collective authoritarian societies, they actually thought that the French government told the cartoonist to draw the cartoon. They don't have an idea that actually the concept of freedom of speech is to protect individuals from governments, that they actually can talk whatever they want without any restrictions. So because many of them don't really have a concept of what actually individual rights is, and like the concept of the Enlightenment, and that there's only one example, which is Tunisia, that is to some extent probably, I mean, it's where the Arab Spring started. It seems like it's where the Arab Spring ended, because it's the only success story we have of all the other failed states. So we need to be able to promote these ideas and take the collective mindset, the concept of honor, that the woman, its duty is to serve, she should not be an individual, but she should serve the honor of the family. She should do everything according to whatever the moral or societal code, sometimes even tribal code, should be. Like they don't look at individuals as just individual who happens to be a woman, but rather a woman a part of a big, and that's, to me, is to some extent a form of slavery, is that women are not being viewed as individuals, but rather being viewed as just part of a collective, that they should do everything according to that, whatever the mindset of the head of the tribe or the head of the family, and so on. There is something which is, I think, very important, which is look at the geopolitical solution, which is the relationship, the US and the Western relationship with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Iran should be looked with very high suspicions. The idea that they are allies is just nonsense. And they are, and it's really funny how each of them like call each other like a state sponsor of terrorism, which is bullshit, because both of them are involved in it. Is that when it comes to Saudi Arabia and Qatar, they have been promoting the ideology of Wahhabism and Salafism all across. I mean, mostly, I mean, you can see the effect in Southeast Asia a lot. Now, if you are familiar with the killing of the atheist Bengali bloggers. And because with Saudi Arabia, that was during the Cold War, they were building something called madrasa, which is actually just being school in Arabic. But the students of this madrasa are the Taliban. And so Saudi Arabia, with the help of the ISI, with the Pakistani intelligence, I think some of them are watching this show, so hi everyone, is that they are parts, to a large extent, they have created the Taliban, which is back at the time to defeat the Soviet Union back in Afghanistan. And they are still building this madrasa to spread this ideology of Wahhabism that is the ultra conservative version of Islam. I mean, that's what actually built up many of the foundation of what we now call terrorist groups as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Like, you cannot dissociate ISIS from the theology of Wahhabism and Salafism. I mean, they may take it to a very different level, but it's the ideological foundation is mostly there. And with Qatar now, they're a sponsor of the Muslim Brotherhood, and with Iran, they are the sponsor of Wilayat al-Faqih, which is the like the Shia version of theocracy. A very also important thing, which I think generally tend to be ignored, is that the apologists who are mostly the Islamists, the Brotherhood, and who stay here in the West, the best way to deal with them, at least on the media, is to actually turn them into a joke. And that's actually a very successful way of doing things, because one of the things is that they take themselves very seriously. And when you, and they think that they have something new to say every time, which is nonsense, because they actually just repeat, like I've debated some of them, and I was debating, they were just like reading from the same paper. Like they're not really creative. And when you deal with them as a joke, and they take themselves so seriously, they just lose their minds. And when they lose their minds, it's not only fun, but actually shows to the audience and the ones who are watching how crazy they really are. And that has been very helpful to me when I do debates with them. Because at the beginning, they come like as nice and very sweet. And I start punching nerves. I start making fun of them. And then they start going crazy. And they start like shouting loud stuff. And then they immediately like lose many of the support of at least the liberal base, the liberal American base that they try to get their sort of help from. That being said, never lose hope that this process of reformation or secularization in the Middle East or even the Muslim world can happen, and not fall into, in my opinion, the fear-mongering of people like Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, who fall into the other extreme of far-right generalizations about how, because we need the secular Muslims as our allies. We need the liberal Muslims. We need these women rights activists and gay rights activists to some of them can come to the United States and study, and not this idea we should ban anybody who looks Muslim or sounds Muslim and any of that. That actually, in my opinion, is very unhelpful, and it also feeds into the gray zone that ISIS wants. So like you'll see that the people who are secular Muslims, or I would say, or atheists even from the Muslim world, tend to be attacked by the Islamists and the far right at the same time. And they need less enemies. I mean, just dealing with Islamists is enough. So it's better to reduce the amount of, and show that we are actually on their side, and we don't want to fight them, and we don't hate Muslims as people, whatever this Islamophobia folks talk about. And that brings me to I hope guys you're not tired, but that brings me to the important debate, which I think is happening a lot across campuses. I assume this is one of them, is the discussion about Islamophobia and the term Islamophobia, and whether this term is actually important, and whether it's not important, in my opinion. And I would like to make the argument for that, is that, I mean, this subject, the one I'm talking about right now, has become extremely poisonous. Like, it's just, I cannot imagine like how many emails I get per day of many people who are in their 20s, who are like just graduating, and who want to talk about, they're journalists, they're studying political science and so on, economics and so on. They are just afraid, not necessarily physically, but are afraid for their careers just to touch on the subject of Islam. Is that the moment they just start saying, whether it's positive or negative, they start getting hate mail left or right with, I mean, if you criticize Islamism and if you criticize the Brotherhood, that's like you committed a blasphemy. And you'll see that hundreds of articles written about you on articles like Salon and Alternate or Raw Story, how much you are an Uncle Tom, a Zionist, whatever, like the porch monkey, Nawaz was called a porch monkey, very terrible names, very racist names, just by touching on the subject of Islam. And that's, like obscurantism has made it kind of very impossible. Like many people are afraid to even engage in that discussion. And because the discussion has been very paranoid, so this is kind of, I'm giving you some sort of like a media training. If one day some of you would like to pursue a degree in political science, or if you are pursuing a degree in political science in which you're going to show on television and talk about the subject, and So these are the 6 major categories in which many people who are on the media when they talk about Islam. And these are the 6, I mean, I'm going to talk about generally in the Arab world and also the Western media, Fox News or CNN or whatever your political alignment is. So the 6 groups are Muslim conservatives and Muslim moderates and reformers. Another group is the pseudo-liberal apologists. And then there is the genuine critics of Islam. And then there is the pro-Christian right, the Ted Cruz-like anti-Muslim groups, and also the far-right Jewish groups that exist here in the United States. And I'll try to define group one by one. So that's going to be helpful for you if you're going to be engaging in the media talking about the subject. So the first group, Muslim conservatives. So the Muslim conservatives, and this is not in any sense a generalization. So I try my best to be as specific as possible. That's why I try to put things in a spectrum and not like paint a brush everyone in the same umbrella. So Muslim conservatives believe that Islam is perfect and the Quran contains no errors. They generally view liberalism as a Western invention and incompatible with their interpretation of their faith. They believe that there is kind of a cosmic war happening between the Dawah of Islam or the Muslim world, and the majority of them are non-violent, but the ultra-conservatives of them, they're Wahhabis or Salafi, tend to support violent jihad against the West, including civilians. So there's a guy, for example, Al-Qardawi, who shows up on Al Jazeera Arabic. And I want to just give a bit note about Al Jazeera Arabic, because Al Jazeera English and Al Jazeera Arabic give a very different messaging. So Al Jazeera Arabic is like the Fox News of America. They're extremely conservative, right-wing, following the ideology of Qatar, of Islamism. And suddenly, on the English version, they talk about minority rights and gay rights. So as somebody who speaks 2 languages, it's kind of very weird for me to see Qatar, which is on one sentence in Arabic saying that gays should be put in jail and they're mentally ill, and Al Jazeera English, they're suddenly talking about gays being minority rights, and we should support Democratic Party, we should support same-sex marriage. Like, uh-oh, is this like the same channel over here? So Al Jazeera Arabic tend to be there's so many times I've heard, this really advanced the political ideology of the Qatar royal family. It's owned by the Qatar royal family, including the English version. But the English version kind of have a different management. So that's where generally like the ultra-Muslim conservatives show. That's where they show their face, and they talk about all this ultra-conservative stuff. Then there's the Muslim moderates, who also consider the Quran to be perfect. And they always talk about this, ISIS has nothing to do with Islam and all of these things. But they don't follow the interpretations that advocate for violent jihad. And they deny that there is any link exists between violent jihad and Islam. They are the ones who show up on Western media and saying that Islam is a religion of peace, terrorism has nothing to do with Islam, and all these terrorist groups as like anti-Islamic or un-Islamic. But at the same time, they're not going to call them blasphemers, because that's where you can pick them right there, and they will go crazy with it. So their views on human rights follow it's a very big spectrum. Even though they're non-violent, but if you ask them a question about what if all the Sharia law or the Sharia conditions were fulfilled, would the same belief you hold now changes? And yes, many of them change this. Like many people say, I welcome gays that are equal citizens right now, but if if we become the majority of reestablish the Sharia law, then maybe I'm going to change my mind about gays. Maybe they should be killed then. So they belong to a very big spectrum, and the ones who already exist in majority Muslim countries, they tend to be much more conservatives than the one who live here. They don't believe that there is a cosmic war, but at the same time, they justify jihad, like what the Al-Qaeda is doing or Hezbollah and stuff, as a way to address grievances against Western capitalism. So they don't say, I support ISIS, but they say, well, if the United States never invaded Iraq, maybe they brought it themselves, or something like that. Or if Charlie Hebdo never drew a cartoon about Muhammad, maybe they wouldn't have been killed. So they don't say, oh, we support the people who killed Charlie Hebdo, but they brought it to themselves. This is the approach generally that the moderates follow. And so some moderate Muslim organizations, and at least call themselves moderate organizations, often act like PR firms, and that's where places like CARE, Center of American Islamic Relations, and ISNA and CAGE in the United Kingdom, and they're seen on television, like people like Mahdi Hassan and Murtaza Hussain and Linda Sarsour, and who always follow this double faces approach. And then there is the other group, which I think is a very important one. And I'm glad that now they're getting some media representation that they never used to get before. Like before, whenever there's a terrorist attack, they invite the same moderate Muslim organization, the CAIR representative or whatever. But now the Muslim reformers, like people like Majid Nawaz, Asrar Nomani, Zuhdi Jasser, who I met today, now are getting some media attention that I think that they were highly ignored, and now I think their voices are kind of getting heard. Not necessarily I agree with many of the things they say, but I'm glad, because I mean, at the end of the day, even though I'm an atheist, and I've been very public about it, so I don't deny, I'm not lying, I care at the end of the day about liberal secular democracy. I mean, I would rather, I mean, it comes to voting, I would rather vote for a Muslim who believes in liberal secular democracy than vote for an atheist who is a totalitarian communist. I mean, I'm going to be, like, at the end of the day, I care about values like civil society and interfaith, in which people from different faiths, I mean, I'm sure many of you live in big cities in which you have people from all over the world practicing different faiths and so on. This is the values that I really care about. Like, I don't care, I mean, ideally, I would like to people see people more rational and they believe things based on evidence. But that is not the real world that we live in right now. And it's okay, as long as people can engage in civil society and participate, and that's what I really care about. So I endorse reform, not necessarily because I agree with the values, but I see them as doing great work to advance the societies that live under Islamic, or people who believe in the Islamic religion. So many of them may not consider the Quran to be perfect or literal word of God, and they believe that some of its commandments are not applicable in the 21st century. They try to rally against extremist interpretation. So you see, like people like Majid Nawaz always talks about how Wahhabism and ideas of Salafism and so on are bad, and many of them tend to accept liberal, I mean, at least liberal in social sense, liberal values, and they don't deny that there is a link between some interpretations of Islam, or at least Islamic literalism, and terrorism. And many of them support separation of church and state. So somebody can say, I believe in an interpretation that is peaceful, but at the same time acknowledge that people like Wahhabis and Salafists have a convincing argument using theology. You don't have to say, no, well, that has nothing to do with Islam, and my Islam is the right way, and they're all wrong. You can, at the same time, acknowledge that there is a need to reform Islam, or to make the liberal point of view the common one, at least in the Muslim world. So names, I mean, Majid Nawaz is the head, I think, of the Quilliam Foundation. Asrar Nomani, she works at the Muslim Reform Movement, and she also, like, she appeared on Bill Maher, I think, 3 weeks ago. Not 3 weeks ago, 2 months ago. And Raheel Raza, her friend, who was also part of the Muslim Reform Movement, she's also appeared on Bill Maher 3 weeks ago. And Irshad Manji, who I think lives in New York, and advocates for LGBT rights within Muslim context. And so then there is the opposition to the Muslim Reform Movement and also the Muslim secularists. And these are the pseudo, I call them the pseudo-liberals, who generally non-Muslim white liberals who have a big dose of white guilt and graduated from White Guilt University in California. And their arguments is that, which is kind of very simple. So they rallied with the Muslim Brotherhood, and they, to some extent, follow their same logic of why these terrorist groups exist. And so they will say, like, the same arguments made by moderates. And what is kind of problematic is that they say anybody who is motivated, anybody who's critical of Islamism or radical interpretation of Islam has to be motivated by hatred of minorities. I mean, one of the biggest debates, I think I would say, in 2015, which the discussion between Sam Harris and Ben Affleck, have you guys seen that? In which, and that really showed the debates in the liberal left about, so like, Sam Harris was kind of talking similar arguments to what I'm saying, is that we should look at the world, Muslim world as a spectrum, and there are jihadists and there are Islamists and so on. The first response from Ben Affleck was, "You're a racist," or something like that. "You're gross and racist," to quote him literally. So these are the people who are making the job extremely difficult for people who are like, who try to advance LGBT rights and stuff. So like they say that like someone who's a gay Muslim or a gay from a Muslim background say like, "Oh, I'm being persecuted for being gay in Afghanistan," whatever. They say, "No, we may agree with you, but I think the reason why you're saying that is because you're motivated by hatred of Muslims," which is complete bullshit. I mean, the guy is just telling his story. And that actually is making it very difficult for these people to tell their stories, because the moment they start saying that, they'll tell them like, "Oh, you must have an agenda of what you're saying. Are you paid by the Israelis? Are you paid by the whatever? Are you paid by the neocons?" I'll always tell them like, "Where's my fucking paycheck? I've been accused of working for Israelis for 15 years, and I don't have any check from the Mossad. Like, where the hell is the check? Like, I want to have a big house and 2 apartments. If there's all these billions of dollars that the Mossad is giving for secularists, please, like, if you're watching, please send me the check." And they say that the same arguments over and over again to anybody who speaks. Somebody's like a women rights activist, a gay rights activist, so on. The moment they talk about gay rights, "Oh, you are paid by this. You must be motivated." And what's happening is that they make, so like if the moderate Muslims make the argument, what they do is that they retweet. So like, and some of them have big viewership, and suddenly the lie that this person is kind of an agent or paid by somebody, or like the reason why he's doing it because he's paid by this person, it just goes viral, because many of these books has 300,000 followers, 400,000 followers, and so it's just a lie by like some guy like C.J. Wallerman. I don't know if you're familiar with a retard like this guy. I'm sorry to use this word, but he's actually, I think, has mental issues. And I've written a full article explaining why I think that. Like, I'm not really using this term just for the, like, I think he really has mental issues. So he wrote some article like, "Oh, this guy is a mass murderer, Zionist, Uncle Tom, bad person, everything." And then like, it's a bullshit article with no editorial approval, anything. You see that this article get like 10,000 shares out of a sudden. And then this so somebody, you search for, let's say, the gay rights activist or whatever, you see their name and you see like the first Google suggestions is Islamophobe, racist, neocon, paid agents, all of that. And that like ruins their reputation. The moment like somebody speaks up, the moment is like they crush them immediately. And these two liberal, unfortunately, many of them get a lot of media attention, and people like Granny Greenwald and who hired Murtaza Hussain, who called, as I said, called Majid Nawaz a porch monkey. So Murtaza Hussain, who called Majid a porch monkey, is actually hired by Glenn Greenwald. And Glenn Greenwald is, I don't know if you're familiar with him, he's the guy who, with Edward Snowden, and he leaked, so he became kind of like the famous dude of anti-NSA, anti-American imperialism, all of these things, and got him a lot of fame. And some of it I think is well-deserved, but at the same time, he started following this liberal apologists, and as Majid called them, the regressive left, in trying to be against all these voices of reform and secularism and so on. So then there is a group which is generally the people who get called racist, like people like Sam Harris. So these are kind of very different. I think they're genuine critics of Islam, and many of them, and Islamism at the same time. Many of them tend to be liberal Democrats, and some of them are atheists, like people like Sam Harris and Bill Maher. They think that there is a correlation correlation between some interpretations of religion and bad behavior. So the main argument of Sam Harris, if you've read The End of Faith and some of his books, is that bad ideas lead to bad behavior. That's not really a radical idea, but just the moment you shift it to the subject of Islam, you're immediately a racist. And they're liberal Democrats that generally care about issues like women's rights and LGBT rights, and aware that there is that extremist group, they see that they're spread all over the Muslim world, and there's a clear link between violence and the fact that they are motivated by some interpretation of that religion. And some of them are critical of other religions, like Sam Harris, who wrote The End of Faith, and Letter to Christian Nation, which has mostly not only about Islam, but most of actually his books are about Christianity. And And the very important thing is that they tend to differentiate between Muslims as people and Islam as a set of ideas. So when they are critical of Islam, they don't necessarily mean that they hate all Muslims, which is kind of like one of the biggest problems, that the moment you touch the subject is that, like somebody like Sam Harris, he was talking about statistics and so on, and actually got the same thing. I was having a debate in Brooklyn. It was called the Islamophobia debates, and I was having a discussion, so that was after the debate, and she said, stop generalizing on all Muslims. I told her, like, did you just listen to what I said? I said Muslims are a spectrum, and there are statistics. The reason why people use statistics to avoid talking about generalization, try to be more specific, and there's a spectrum within Islam, and she says, stop generalizing on Muslims. I was like, can you just repeat what I said? Like, can you please like say what I was saying? And she said, stop generalizing on Muslims. So there are people who, like, no matter how much specifics you get, they will tell you the same argument. Stop generalizing on Muslims. Did you hear what I just said? Like, did you hear that I'm using, like, not I'm using, is that these statistics are being done over and over again, and they just to be taken as on their value. And so, I mean, prominent names of that are people like Sam Harris and Bill Maher and Dawkins, my best friend Al-Rizvi, Sri Lankan writer Al-Mutar, Sarah Haider, and I mean, there's a recent book that Sam Harris published with Majid Nawaz called Islam and the Future of Tolerance, which is kind of a discussion between him and Majid about how should we go within the Muslim world and reform and so on. So which I think is a very important book. That it's a very small book, so you can read it on your way to Chicago if you want to escape the city. Well, because it gets hot here, I assume, right? It's like it looks like Iraq for some reason. So then there is a group. So that's the difference between, as I said, there's a genuine critics of Islam who their agenda, I would call their agenda, I would use the term agenda here. Yeah, their agenda is liberal democracies, that they care about secular liberal democracy and they see the world through the lenses of human rights and liberalism and so on. But there's another group which is kind of very highly critical of Islam, which I call them right for the wrong reasons. They're mostly wrong for the wrong reasons. And that is the far right, Christian right wing and the Jewish far right wing, who kind of see it as a war between two theocracies. So they believe that so they're kind of like the conservative Muslims, but just they change Muslims to Christians and just look the same. Is that they still believe that there's a cosmic war between Christianity and Islam, or Judaism and Islam. And so, for example, they say like we should ban Sharia law. Like there are some states that I don't know if Arizona is one of them, but they wanted to have like this anti-Sharia bills, whatever, by the Republic. Yeah, thank goodness not yet. But well, actually, it's a good thing. But anti-Sharia is a good thing. But at the same time, they say they want to impose Christian theocracy on the city. They want to, so they're theocrats, just like they're theocrats, but different set of theocrats. So they see Islam as at war with Christianity, and they want to impose Christianity. So they don't oppose Islam or Islamism for the same reason that the secular Democrats are doing it. They're using it because they're different religion and they're foreign, and many of them tend to be brown people. So they try to. This group actually tends to have a lot of media coverage, and some of them actually are bigoted people. I mean, for example, take Ann Coulter, which is not a friend of mine. So Ann Coulter, she endorsed Trump, I think, very recently, and who don't necessarily have negative view of only Muslims. I mean, she kind of hate everybody, except white people. I think that's probably her only white Christian people. I mean, she's not very much fan of gays, and she's, I think, opposes abortion, same-sex marriage, Mexicans, you name it. And so people like this, or people like the EDL, the English Defense League, who generally have negative views, like they want to ban immigration all the way. Like they think like they support white nationalist ideas. And what's also, I think, very problematic with them is that they see that like they generalize on, they are the ones who actually generalize on Muslims, in which they say there is only one way to interpret Islam, and that is the Wahhabi Salafist ideology. And if you do not subscribe to this interpretation, they say like you're kind of like practicing taqiyya. I'm sure you kind of heard this word about like, oh, you're lying. You're not really a moderate Muslim, but you're actually a potential terrorist. I mean, I kind of get this, like, that I'm an atheist, want to impose Sharia law in America. I was like, okay, that's an interesting way of saying it. Is that they think that I'm actually lying about my atheism. They think that I'm actually like some undercover jihadist who's who's saying that he's an atheist and get all these death threats because he's an atheist, just so I can fake it enough to impose Sharia law on Americans. So now you know the secret. I'm sorry to tell you about it, but so they're like literally insane. Like many of them have they engage in very like conspiracy theories. I mean, when it comes to President Obama, I mean, they said that he is a Muslim born in Kenya who's trying to impose Sharia law on the United States. Like, if he's a Muslim, he's the worst Muslim ever. Like he drinks alcohol, he smoked weed, I think. So he like follows. He's like literally the worst Muslim ever. Like, if he's literally a Muslim, like I wish the majority of Muslims were like Obama. So they think that, so like this kind of birther conspiracy theories, like Donald Trump was the one who made that shit. I mean, Donald Trump was the one who said that, like, show me your birth certificate. And then that thing actually went viral to some extent in these circles about like Obama is actually some sort of undercover jihadist, and they always say like Barack Hussein Obama. They always mention the Hussein part to show that there's actually, guys, like we've gotcha, like we figured out that he is trying to impose the Sharia law, and you should be fearful. We should kick this out guy from America, so I mean it's mostly fear mongering, and many of that. I mean they have a political agendas that not necessarily like that probably has hardly to do anything with the human rights and secular values, even care for the well-being of the Muslims or the Arab world. And people like Bridget Gabriel, Wallace Shabat, Pamela Geller, who's like Pamela Geller is like, if you look at her Facebook page, it's like very interesting. It's like everything is like Muslim related. Like you see like someone stole a pack of cigarettes in Wisconsin. I was like, oh, do you know there's this Muslims guy? Like everything has to be related to Muslims in one way or another. And like Obama is trying to take our guns. So like it starts with a Muslim and ends up with Obama trying to take our guns. And it's all like, you see like, and that which is kind of very unfortunate, because to some extent, the reason why she got hardly, like some extent popular, because of the problem with the left, that they try to ignore the problem of radical Islam, that created a vacuum for nut jobs like Pamela Geller, like people I assume Trump is one of these people who kind of like the guy who's like, I'm gonna, because of the hardly any discussion, especially like as I said with Bernie Sanders, then I assume Hillary kind of progressed today. She said radical jihadism, so she kind of evolved a bit. But when people on the left ignore the problem, what happens is that there are going to be people who are generally have very bad agendas who are going to fill the vacuum with the crazy shit like what Pamela Geller and others are talking about. So I think the most important, I hope that you guys learn something, is that what I really want, like the point I want to explain from the second part of the speech, is that those who believe in Islam and those who criticize it fall into a very broad spectrum. And there is no one school of belief in Islam, and there's no one school of criticism on Islam. So if you are a media consumer, or if you are a media person, is that how can you distinguish between somebody who's not job like Pamela and somebody like Sam Harris or Bill Maher or Ali Rizvi and so on, is that you look at how much they engage in conspiracy theories, number one, how much they engage in generalizations, and saying that whenever the statement, like they start with all, like one of the famous quotes of Mark Twain, he said that all generalizations are false, including this one. So anybody who engages in broad generalizations that all, you immediately see that this person is full of shit. And what is the kind of intention why somebody is doing what he's doing? Is that he's criticizing, I mean, because as I said, many of these folks who like talk about Obama being a secret Muslim, passing Sharia law, they are to some extent trying to impose another political agenda. So they say like, Trump is a Muslim, vote for Trump. Let me repeat. Obama is a Muslim, vote for Trump. And so they have an apparent political agenda that tries to discredit the other candidate to the way to tell you, well, but this guy is the lesser of two evils. You may not like Trump, but he's not, at least not a Muslim trying to impose Sharia law, or not a socialist Jew who's trying to impose Sharia law. And so it's very important to know if it's like it's coming from a place of a theocrat, like somebody who's the far Christian right Republicans who try to impose Christian theocracy, but that's the reason why they oppose Sharia law, or the people who actually care about human rights and oppose Sharia law for merely its views on the way it treats women and treats gays and so on, and whether somebody has a geopolitical agenda related to Israel and their actions toward the Palestinians and so on. So does it come from a concern, like a place of concern for the well-being or the human rights of people, or does it come for just to advance a political agenda? And for the distinction between the pseudo-liberals and the moderate Muslims and the reformers, is that the distinction between a moderate Muslim and the reformer is that the reformers admit that there's a connection between certain radical interpretation of Islam and terrorism, and they don't blame all the ills of what's happening in the Arab world and the Muslim world in general on like Jews, and let's blame the Jews for everything, and let's blame the US foreign policy for everything. So this is where my sympathies lies with them. And if you guys want to be involved in like trying to help secular activists in the Arab world and the Muslim world, I think there's a flyers of my organization, movements.org. And thank you for listening. And may science and bless the United States of America. I actually thought I was like Rubio, in which I drink water every minute, but it seems like I've changed. So I think there's Q&A for, what time is it? It's not 11. Oh, that's New York time. Yeah. Yeah. So I think there's I think few minutes. So if you guys have any questions. Okay. Sure. Go ahead.
I went to a movie here. It was about Saudi Arabia, and one of the professors from it was called Saudi Arabia.
Interesting. That's a very creative name. Yeah.
One of the professors here that teach Arabic, I asked her about Sharia law because, of course, I don't understand what it is exactly. But she said it's more of a lifestyle than a set of laws. Really didn't seem to have a problem with it. But, I mean, what do you think of it?
Yeah, that's a playing word. That's playing semantics. Yeah. There is this jihad is a struggle. This is a personal struggle. This is nonsense. Is that? I mean, words have meanings based upon what the majority of people think they are. You know, is that if the majority of people think that apple is actually an apple, then that's what apple is. Like nobody's gonna think it means orange. Okay, so what's happening is like the interpretation that Sharia is something personal or jihad is internal struggle. Like, oh, I'm making a jihad about my exam. Nobody says that. Like anybody who's Arabic speaking over here. Yeah, who says that I'm going to jihad on my exam? Like nobody says that, because the term jihad doesn't mean personal internal struggle. It means what it means. It means that it has to do with policies and armies, and so yes, I mean if she wants to play with words like this and say like smoking weed, like I always make this joke about like smoking weed makes something else in Iraq than in Manhattan. So if they're gonna play like the term getting stoned may actually ring a bell here. So here's the thing: is like Sharia law is a theological sense. It's used as a way to implement laws in a certain land. So it's a law. I mean the term Sharia itself is like hukm al-Sharia. It like come from Islamic law. It's nothing to do with like, I mean, obviously maybe that's the ways, like because probably Muslims here, because they live in a minority, in a minority context, they try to fit it to their own. I mean, there's a field called behavioral economics in which when people tend to be minorities, they kind of internalize their beliefs and kind of shift them. When they're a majority, they tend to be much more extreme and much more, and they try to force everybody to force their laws. So like, just like what I was telling you about the Islamists, in which they will say like, we support secularism and minority rights and so on. These are the same Islamists who lobbied kind of get the US to invade Iraq. And when they got in power, fuck minority rights. Like we are now in power, and so they deal with it's minority majority dynamics. Is that they have a different interpretation when they're a minority. The moment they get in power, is something else.
Thanks.
Something for this. Thank you, Faisal, for being here.
Of course.
My name is Salim Souza. I'm actually came from the same place you came from,
Yeah.
from Iran. And for the Sharia law, actually, it's not, Islam is not monolithic. It's not central.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
Yeah, there's different Sharia law, actually.
Yeah.
Each group has Sharia law, and inside one group has different Sharia law. So saying like Ben Carson, what it says last year, Muslims should be banned and should be not be like should be not be nominated
Yeah.
to the presidential house, but just because they believing in Sharia law,
Yeah.
it's kind of not correct things to put it because if he says if Muslim believe in Sharia law of ISIS,
Yeah.
that would be like kind of understandable. But if you say Sharia law in general, no, Sharia law is not that kind of things. It's just
But I think my example of what like throwing gays from second floor and fourth floor is that I think both of them are wrong. Like,
that should be taken out of its historical context. You know, there is a lot of Muslim, black Muslims, right?
Yeah.
Muslims that believe in that.
I agree.
Just have any.
Yeah, yeah.
And there is, we should differentiate between two important terms here: fundamentalism and extremism. Fundamentalism should not be, does not necessarily mean extremists. I mean, there we have principal people here like believe in fundamentalism, sure, but they're not like extremist people. They don't believe in violence in that sense. I mean, it's very, very dangerous position here. I'm pretty sympathetic with you because I came from.
Yeah.
It's always a problem. You try to like you drawing your line between two things. You came from Middle East and you live here and you have kind of
Yeah.
a clear picture about two cultures, and that's what Edward Said says about Orientalism. Some people are like Orientalist thinking about the Middle East, and the others in this other book, cultural imperialism, take the other position that always, we are actually Orientalist in that way also. We are also always like obsessive with the U.S. media. Oh, this is against Islam. This is against it. But that's not right. I mean, I'm very, very impressive with what you say. You impressed me about this speech. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that to some extent I covered all of that. I mean, I tend to be as specific as possible. I mean, I don't necessarily agree that there is any liberal interpretations of Sharia. I don't think there is anybody who says, I believe in Sharia law, and that Sharia law is compatible with liberal democracy. I mean, for a person like Ben Carson, I mean, he's a theocrat. So, like, my standard is not Ben Carson. And I'm glad it is not Ben Carson. So, if I'm going to judge, like, let's say, I'm going to say my standard right now is liberal secular democracy with acceptance for the Declaration of Human Rights. Let's put that as the standard. I don't think there is anybody who claims to believe in Sharia that this is compatible with it. Like, there's impossible that you can have Sharia law. Maybe if they're going to play semantics in which the Sharia may actually mean secular law, but they call it Sharia for the sake of the term because they're using it in a religious culture and so on. But it is very unlikely that you see somebody who says, I believe in Sharia, bless you, I believe in Sharia and gay rights. It's very unlikely. I mean, maybe there's going to be this person, and I pray for Flying Spaghetti Monster that this guy's going to exist. But it's, I mean, and also when it comes to fundamentalists and extremists, I think, I mean, it's, yes, there are people who believe things, but not necessarily act on them. That is itself, I mean, it is good, but also dangerous, because what is bad about this is that, for example, in Egypt, I mean, which I think is one of the best examples, is that when you had about, I think, 60 to 70% of Egyptians, I mean, that's based on Pew, maybe they're much more, but I'm just going to assume for the sake of argument that 60, 70%, who believe in Sharia law, or at least let's call it the Muslim Brotherhood version of the Sharia law, of apostates should be killed, women who don't wear headscarf should face persecutions, and gays obviously treated like second-class citizens, if not third, if not fourth, if not fifth. When the elections happen, when there's some sort of democratization happen to Egypt, who did they vote for? The Muslim Brotherhood. So even, and what the Muslim Brotherhood gonna do on a policy level? So there's another case, with the case of Salman Rushdie, the Satanic verses, and you see that many people say, well, I'm not gonna kill Salman Rushdie, but if there's somebody gonna kill Salman Rushdie, I'm okay with it because I do believe that somebody. So the extremists and the fundamentalists are like, let's say, the extremists who not necessarily act violently may hold very bad ideas that lead the people who act violently, so they create a smokescreen for the people who act violently to do it with the acceptance of the people who are fundamentalists. You know what I mean? And even with the, I mean, even if you bring it to a Christian context, to American context, I mean, when somebody believes that abortion is murder, for example, and let's say it's a widespread belief in a certain state, I can assure you most likely these people are gonna vote for a Republican. What they're gonna do on a policy level? They're gonna restrict abortions or ban abortions. So believe, even though he's not the one who's standing in front of Planned Parenthood with a AK-47, but he would be okay of voting for someone who would close the building all the way. So sometimes obviously, I mean, the people who do the acts themselves are much more dangerous, but I think that the people who do the act will not be able to do it without, to some extent, a consensus. Or, I mean, well, both of us are from Iraq. I mean, obviously you're familiar with the Sunni Shia conflict and Baghdad and the people killing each other, right? And it still happens, obviously. I mean, I'm old school when Al-Qaeda was in Iraq. I mean, I'm very old school. So I left in 2009. But if there was some sort of, I mean, not necessarily 100%, it's not a critical mass, but if this language of sectarianism was not already, to some extent, in the mindset of Iraqis, the groups like Jaish al-Mahdi and Al-Qaeda would not be able to have safe households. You know what I mean? Like, Al-Qaeda has a better chance of rising up in Pakistan than they do in Sweden. Because there's a smoke screen that allows the extremists and the fundamentalists to grow. And they're more likely to grow up in societies that are more sympathetic to them, or at least groups that are sympathetic to them, based upon some tensions that happen, like a Sunni gets killed in a neighborhood, and then the Sunnis are getting mobilized, and the Shia get killed in the neighborhood, and the Shia getting mobilized. So if there was these already coexisting beliefs within fundamentalists or conservatives, people like Al-Qaeda or Jaish al-Mahdi and all will not be able to have a safe household in which they can. So sometimes, I mean, I try to differentiate between, but I think, like, for me, the level of differentiation is like whether we are with cancer level 1 or cancer level 2. Is that I mean, I support chemotherapy all the way. I think we should deal with both of them on a different level. I mean, mostly ideologically, but if force is needed, then I think it's an option to be put on the table. Sure.
How do you view like heads of state like Benazir Bhutto from Pakistan?
The one who was killed, you mean?
Right.
Yeah.
Try to like reconcile like democratic principles and Islamic principles as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's possible. I mean, as I told you, like there's people like Majid Nawaz and Asra Nomani, who identify as Muslim and see, to some extent, that at least their interpretation of Islam is compatible with values of liberal democracy. I mean, obviously, I'm not a practicing Muslim, so I'm not going to speak for Muslims on their behalf. But I read their books, and that's their main argument, is that they try to put the Quran and the verses in context. It is very hard work, and that is to some extent. I mean, I still remember I had one of the discussions which was kind of about the same subject, and it was to some extent about like women's rights and individual rights and so on. And they asked me, like, there was a liberal Muslim and a conservative Muslim and me. And they asked me, like, oh, do you believe in individual rights? I told them, yes, of course, as an atheist, I believe that I believe in human rights, and I believe all humans are equal, and everybody deserves an equal share, right? The conservative Muslim was immediately like, the Quran is against gays and immediately gave a 5 seconds answer, okay? So I gave 5 seconds answer, he gave 5 seconds answer. The liberal Muslim was talking for like 30 minutes, trying to explain why kills should not be killed. And that's one of the reasons why I would say, I don't know if it is their fault, because there is no easy way to figure out like the concept of democratization and so on, because democratization cannot go without the concept of individual rights. I mean, to a large extent, what we now call Western democracies, they're not only just 1% saying what the 49% are saying. There's a concept of Bill of Rights in which, regardless whether Democrat or Republican is winning, is that there's like constitutional republic. Like most of the democracies, what we call now, right now, protect individual rights regardless of who is the majority. You know, this concept needs to be is now being addressed within the discussion of Islam. And people like Benazir Bhutto, I don't know why she was assassinated. I know that Salman Taseer, who is another man who was killed recently, was killed because he supported the right for a Muslim to convert to Christianity, who was, I think, from the same party she is. He was killed in, I think, Lahore. So, yes, I think that it can be compatible for some people who probably work so hard to make it, and I wish them all the luck. And as I said, like, we should support them every time we want to. Not everyone we want to, every time they want to. So they decide the terms and we try our best to help them. See how much time we have. Yeah, I think one question. Yeah.
So, in the West, whether it's in the United States or in Europe, how could we help move discussion about Islam or terrorism away from either being, oh my God, Islam is like a civilizational clash with the West, and the other extreme, Muslims are peace-loving, and that terrorism has nothing to do with religion. How do we move towards having conversation, either in Europe or the West, about the different spectrum of different Muslims and the ideas of supporting secularism, supporting democracy and individual rights in the Middle East?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest issues of, I think the term West is very general, so like I don't want to talk in these terms, but like I would say like channels like Fox and MSNBC and is that there's always an attack on nuance in general. You can know sometimes what is somebody's view on abortion from asking them about gun control, which is kind of very funny, right? Is that everybody is like within like the left on the right, or the left media and the right media, like at least this mainstream, there's like the 10 commandments of the right and the left, and you must subscribe to each one of them one by one. And so I think the biggest issue, and I think the issue is much larger than just like the debate of Islam, I think is that the not ability of having any nuanced discussion about everything. And I think the more we focus on talking about nuance and specifics and evidence and stop using this populist language of ban all Muslims, accept all refugees, let's get the hell out, like this language. And I think that because I think the subject is, and look at me, like I gave a talk for an hour and a half and I was just like covering a bit of the subject. Is that because the subject is very complicated, I think sometimes because of this, like I would say like how the media was designed, but rather like how they think the attention span of the audience is. So like now, that's if you look at the media, they put like 5 minutes video, but like if you look at Twitter, it's 140 characters, and Vine, that is 10 seconds. And like now it's like most of the media is turning into, let's book a clickbaity title and let's get the simplest way of dealing with things. And that is, I think, when you're talking about complicated subjects, and even if you take leave Islam alone, like if you talk about quantum mechanics, there was this thing about God's particle. I don't know if you remember it, but so they put this God's particle clickbaity title, and most of the people talking about God's particle don't know what the hell is God's particle. They say like the people who believe in God immediately thought that this is evidence for God, and they have no idea what the article is about. They just like God's particle. I saw it on the title. It's the 10 seconds that I wanna hear. It fits my already perceived notions of how the world should be, and I just look this 10 seconds, and that's it. I figured out the solution for the universe. And I think we need to get rid of that idea to begin with. Is like when you're talking about, you have to give the subject and each subject its fair share. Whether somebody's talking about medicine or somebody talking about physics or politics or sociology or economics, like these subjects are multi-layered, complicated, and this concept of like, like how many times like I see like some of my friends who are like policy analysts who work like for Brookings and big think tanks and stuff. And they're like, oh, in 10 seconds, what do you think of the Iraq war? Yeah, are you fucking kidding me? Because like you ask somebody who's like been studying the Iraq war and PhDs at Harvard and stuff, tell us in 10 seconds what the whole war was about. What do you think the US should do? What should we, I mean, these are complicated subjects. And I think that what is very important is to, I think, advance the culture of nuance and being able to see things in a multi-layered way and not try to say like, oh, this is the reason why this happened. This is the only reason. No, you have to look at things through many different angles and through many different studies and so on. So I hope that answers, kind of it's a long answer, but I think it answers your need for short answers. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening.